Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation as part of the Industry Insight webinar series. The topic this time is Leveraging the Safety Act, Building an Effective Security Program. Speaking today will be Adam Isles. Adam Isles is the principal at TCG, where he helps clients build security programs. A security expert with more than 20 years of experience, Isles has managed security service engagements for clients in a number of industries, including financial services, utility, transportation, retail, and technology sectors. Projects have included security risk assessments, market entry security assessments, M&A cyber due diligence reviews, security strategy development, organizational reviews, insider threat program development, exercises, senior management training, penetration test risk overlays, and security audits. Prior to joining TCG, Isles worked at Raytheon Company, where he was the Director of Strategy and Policy Consulting for Homeland Security. Previously, Isles served as the Deputy Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where he worked daily with the DHS Secretary to coordinate department-wide operations. Before joining DHS, Isles served at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he started his legal career as a trial attorney in the criminal division in 1997. He holds a JD from Harvard Law School and a Bachelor of Arts in History from Yale University. The presentation today will be followed by a Q&A. Please enter your questions into the question box in the webinar panel on the right side of your screen. All questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. We are recording this webinar, and we will be sending a video and a follow-up email in a few days. We'll also post the video on our blog at www.lawtechnologytoday.org. Thank you all for joining us. We'll now begin the webinar.
Thanks much. And good to talk to you all over this webinar. Fundamentally, the question we get asked a lot by clients is, how do I know if I have an effective security program in place? And so what we'd like to accomplish today really is to go over three learning objectives. The first of which is to understand how to think about changing risks facing modern enterprises. The second of which is to understand the Safety Act and how it applies to security risk management. And the third is to talk a little bit about the Chertoff Group's own approach and how it can help enterprises build and maintain an effective security program. So let's start by talking a little bit about the Safety Act. The Safety Act was passed by Congress in 2002, and its purpose was to foster the development of effective, quote-unquote, anti-terrorism technologies by providing important legal liability protections to manufacturers and sellers of those technologies where the technologies could save lives in a terrorist attack. So to paraphrase the actual statute itself, the protection essentially involves this. Notwithstanding any other provision of law, liability for all claims arising out of, relating to, or resulting from an act of terrorism when qualified anti-terrorism technologies have been deployed in defense against, or response, or recovery from such act shall not be in an amount greater than the limits of liability insurance that are required to be maintained under the Act. And so it applies in acts of terrorism. And so then the next question is, well, what does an act of terrorism actually look like? And the statute lays out three elements. The first of which is that the act in question is unlawful. The second of which is that it causes harm to a person or property or to an entity in the United States, or if we're talking about an air carrier or a vessel inside or outside the U.S. And third, that it uses weapons, instrumentalities, other methods that are designed or intended to cause mass destruction, injury, or other loss to citizens or institutions of the United States. Now, even though there's a U.S. focus, particularly in the cyber context, our view is that the source of the attack doesn't itself need to be launched from within the United States. It applies the Safety Act protections due to a broad range of quote-unquote technologies. And the important thing here is that it applies both to products, services, and it's been interpreted to apply basically to security programs as well, as we'll talk about in a moment. It also appears to extend to the users of these technologies, to our clients. And so there is in the rule that implements the Safety Act language that basically says an action may not be brought against buyers, contractors, downstream users of the capability in question, the sellers, suppliers, or contractor, or any other person or entity. And so what we've seen since the Act came into effect is over 800 approvals by DHS of security products and services. And those include everything from Bank of America's Critical Infrastructure Protection Program to FireEye cybersecurity product, the Southwest Airlines security program, numerous security capabilities provided by Boeing, the National Football League and National Basketball Association security standards and best practices, IBM's QRadar security intelligence platform, Raytheon's security equipment and integration services capability, as well as numerous security programs within the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey for Newark, LaGuardia, World Trade Center, George Washington Bridge, and related infrastructure. Now, what does it actually take to obtain Safety Act approval? There are a number of stringent criteria that include, but are not limited to, demonstrated substantial utility and effectiveness, the availability to be deployed immediately, and the existence of extraordinarily large or unquantifiable third-party liability risk exposure. So let's talk a little bit about what effectiveness actually looks like. And so we'll do it by using an analogy. So what you see on your screen is a map of something called the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line was named after the French Minister of War, André Maginot, and it was essentially a line of fortifications, weapons installations, obstacles built by France in the aftermath of World War I to deter another invasion by Germany. It cost around 3 billion French francs at the time, and it was theoretically impervious to most forms of attack, including aerial bombardment, tanks. It had underground railways, it had air conditioning for troops. The problem was that the French line itself was actually weak near the Ardennes forest, and the Germans figured that out. The Germans reformulated their battle plans after World War I, and they exploited this vulnerability to, starting in May of 1940, rapidly advanced through the Ardennes forest and claimed victory over France in the space of a mere 6 weeks. So what you're seeing on your screen now is the Maginot fortification being admired by German Wehrmacht troops after the capitulation of France. And so what's the takeaway from this historical analogy? Right, I mean, it's a point not just around over-reliance and what you'd call a boundary defense, but it's also a point about how to think about accounting for changes in an adaptive threat. In this case, the changes in German military capabilities between World War I and World War II. And so recent news headlines demonstrate how security threats have continued to adapt over time, both in terms of objectives and tactics, techniques, and procedures. If we think about kind of terrorism recently, a common factor is obviously ease of opportunity. We think about, whether you want to call it terrorism related or not, the attacks in Las Vegas earlier this fall that left 58 people dead and almost 550 injured. Think about the Halloween attacks in New York that killed 8 people, the Orlando nightclub shooting, the Manchester Stadium attack. But we can't lose sight of other trends with potentially more significant impact. The UN and security agencies in numerous countries have warned about, with the fall of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, the return of numerous foreign fighters to their home countries who now have benefited from training in terrorism-related tactics, techniques, and procedures. But likewise, aviation has been a target of interest to terrorism groups for decades, as we know, and their tactics, techniques, and procedures, particularly with respect to the ability to secrete an explosive device onto an aircraft, continue to evolve, as was demonstrated in Somalia last year. And again, as we look at this, the purpose of this is not to alarm, but to inform. The basic idea is that risk elimination is impossible, and that security programs need to reflect an adaptive threat. And this holds true in a cyber context as well. So as we think about recent headlines, we've obviously seen the news about Uber and about Equifax. But in a number of the other major attacks that we've seen in 2017, we see a common factor around what we call the subversion of trust. So we all use passwords. Many folks use passwords, the same password for multiple applications. And so when a password for one application is compromised, there too fall the other applications. And so we've seen a tremendous rise in what are called credential stuffing attacks that attempt to basically use subverted credentials in gaining unauthorized access to systems. So we think about events that occurred earlier this summer. Some of you may have heard about the NotPetya ransomware attack that basically leveraged tax software for companies doing business in Ukraine that had malware embedded in it that, when deployed, had the effect of disrupting computer systems in victim organizations. And so we saw the effects of that attack impacting shipping organizations like Maersk to the tune of as much, now actually more than $300 million, and disrupting operations for multiple weeks. Another example of trust subversion is a scenario that we saw earlier this year where the website of the Polish National Banking Regulator was compromised, and so that if you were a bank accessing that website, you could theoretically have had malware downloaded onto your own systems and thus witness further compromise as a result. Likewise, we've seen reports about IT outsourcers being compromised as, if you will, a pathway into victim organizations. And so again, how do we think about the implications of this? If we think about risk as driven by likelihood and severity, certainly a key difference between cyber and physical risk is likelihood. But in a cyber context, everyone, in a sense, has to worry about being compromised by a bad actor. But like physical, in both cases, we need to consider the adaptive nature of threat in the development of programs. Now, cyber risk is not new. And in fact, cyber risk has been addressed via regulation, quasi-regulation, and massive investment, certainly over the last decade, with reports of cyber-related attacks going back into the mid-1980s. Number of information security-related guidance documents are currently available from NIST, ISO, certainly the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council. Some guidance is risk prioritized. So when you think about the Center for Internet Security's 20 critical security controls, the Australian Signals Directorate top 35 mitigation strategies, right? Those are actually prioritized. And then you see actors at the state level in the form of the New York State Department of Financial Services, California Office of Attorney General, also providing guidance in this space. We've also seen a significant rise in investment in defensive cyber capabilities. By our estimates, even as far back as 2013, you had about a $63 billion annual spend on cybersecurity capabilities, products, and services. And we see that rising to over $100 billion in annual spend by 2019. The challenge is how to prioritize planning in the face of an adaptive threat, limited resources, and rapidly changing business and technology environments. And so we went and took a look at 5 years worth of client experiences and filtered those experiences based on two factors. One is you had an organization that was trying to do the right thing, had the cyber risk had the attention of senior management, capabilities were being built. But notwithstanding that, the organization had experienced some significant event, a PCI breach, a ransomware attack, exfiltration of very sensitive data, very significant pen test findings. And what we were looking for were there a set of factors that we saw repeatedly coming up in these organizations? And we identified six implementation risks to consider. The first of which is gaps in the understanding of inherent risk. So what we've seen is problems occurring where the assessment of risk within an organization doesn't fully account for critical assets and how changing business technology and threat drivers can impact an enterprise risk profile. We've seen significant gaps in planning and preparedness. And so even where inherent risk is identified, programs may not succeed in prioritizing resources appropriately. I think a more pointed example of this is, when incidents do occur, responders and victim organizations often identify gaps in preparedness that, had they been addressed earlier, could have substantially mitigated the extent of damage. Third, operational burdens. Tools and technologies, security tools and technologies, as they're implemented, can generate a high volume of security data. And so what you run into are issues around false alerts, large numbers, large volumes of vulnerabilities discovered. And this can have the effect of overwhelming an organization and diverting attention. Fourth are dependencies on IT staff and technology. And so what we see here is that the implementation of security controls can require varying levels of IT staff support. And the program, if IT resources aren't right-sized, can be negatively impacted. Legacy IT infrastructure adds additional risk. Fifth, lack of stakeholder alignment. Business and IT leaders play a key role in advancing the security program. Without education and cultural change, a program can be negatively impacted by a lack of buy-in and a lack of what we'd call internalization of risk. More generally, users are obviously the first line of defense, and user and education awareness becomes key. The last factor is what we'd refer to as a lack of control transparency. And the idea here basically is that without meaningful program evaluation, controls can decay over time. And what you are left with is, if you will, a false sense of security. Likewise, where testing does occur, pen tests and audit reports can be confusing and sometimes lack meaningful risk context. And so what we try to do is to account for those factors. Earlier this year, we received Safety Act designation for our own security risk management methodology. And we think of effectiveness as a continuum or a life cycle. And we have a three-phased approach to risk management that entails considering both physical and cyber risks where a client wants us to. We also believe we're one of the only consultancies in the world to have achieved this level of approval. And so let's talk a little bit about what the methodology looks like and what the continuum looks like. So we start following security best practice with the assessment of risk. And here we're working to identify and characterize critical assets, to analyze threats and vulnerabilities and impacts on identified assets and systems. You then move to mitigation of risk, where we're looking at defense in depth. Can't do everything at once, and so we're thinking about how to prioritize based on risk. We're considering how to factor in talent and key stakeholders and ensure that they have appropriate training, education, and awareness. And we're planning with an assumption that an incident of some sort will happen. As we think about monitoring risk, here we're thinking about, okay, are the capabilities implemented as fully implemented as we think they are and operating as intended? So how are we building processes to ensure that there are audits, testing, and reporting in place, and those audits, pen tests, and reports are actually risk-based? Where we can, we're looking for automation opportunities, and we're enhancing understanding through exercises and simulations. Fundamentally, as we think about core security principles, we're looking for programs that are risk-based, as intuitive as possible, and trusted. And so how does the Safety Act help in this context? We think it helps in at least three ways. First of which is it helps answer the question, do you have an effective security program in place? And if not, what are the key steps that you need to take to get there? I should note that while the Safety Act is obviously terrorism focused, our methodology is all hazards and applies to an assortment of risks. For terrorism-related risks, a certain level of liability protection exists for certain causes of action related to acts of terrorism. So if someone if a client were to be sued on the basis of a flawed methodology. We would argue that liability protection would apply here. Perhaps as important or more important, if organizations have done the work to build an effective security program, they may decide that they want to seek, in the same way that Bank of America, Southwest Airlines, the Port Authority have, their own Safety Act designation or certification to further lessen potential organizational liability. Now, the Safety Act process itself involves an application. There is theoretically a statutory 120-day clock that involves a completeness review, a technical and economic review, consolidation of the analysis and a decision. That time period can be told as questions are asked and answered. The department also offers the opportunity to submit a pre-application, which is basically the opportunity for someone to say, are we within the ballpark here? So as we think about unpacking the life cycle here, right, we think about the first piece of it being around risk assessment. And so, the question is, well, what constitutes risk? And we think of risk as being classically a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. And as we think about inherent risk, what we think about, okay, well, with respect to threat, are we just talking about external actors, or are we also thinking about third parties and insiders? As we think about vulnerabilities, are we thinking just about gaps in a layer of defense itself, or are we also thinking about gaps in governance and gaps in the way testing and training is conducted? And then as we think about consequence, we're certainly thinking about confidentiality loss, we're thinking about losses of integrity and availability, and also about physical harm in the context of a physical attack. Fundamentally, what we're looking at is how do all these factors impact business objectives. It's also important here to focus on how risk actually changes, because what we see, right, is risk can change based on threat, but it can also change based on business drivers, technology drivers, regulatory expectations, and other factors. But going back to our earlier point about implementation risks, fundamentally what we're trying to do here is to kind of help answer the question, do I understand my inherent risk and how that inherent risk is changing? One of the things we found in the context of risk assessment that can help is to do what's called a threat pathways analysis. This is certainly something done in government. In a cyber context, you may have heard about what's referred to as the Lockheed Martin kill chain. But the basic idea here is to use a scenario to crosswalk security capabilities against likely threat scenarios. And we have found, that this kind of an exercise can be very helpful in answering the question of, how do I prioritize the capabilities that I'm actually implementing? As we think about mitigation, right, there's a temptation to focus on particular products and solutions in this context. And from our point of view, we really try to focus on the program as a whole. Obviously, with respect to core security capabilities, we're thinking about building a defense in-depth approach, leveraging the kind of threat pathways analysis that I just showed to orient the program around particularly impactful deterrence and response capabilities. But without effective strategy, oversight, and risk management, the danger, right, is that a security program doesn't stay current as risk changes. And without an effective testing and validation capability, you can be left with a false sense of security and limited accountability. And so what we're fundamentally what we're looking at is, from a mitigation point of view, I have all this capability. Does it actually address reasonably foreseeable threat scenarios? And that's where we start thinking about, with respect to the capabilities in place, are we focusing on high-value assets with graduated controls based on risk? Do we have an effective incident response and recovery capability? And have we built response and recovery capabilities by design? In both a physical and cyber context, we can see the response assets themselves being targeted by attackers. And so it's important to build those contingencies into a security program. Are we building effective situational awareness that can enable us to move very quickly beyond detection to classification and action? Are we addressing the likelihood that an organization's own employees and contractors can be a key point of compromise? Are we employing tactics where possible to confuse and deter an adversary? Things like mobility, unpredictability, and public communications-based deterrent strategies. And are we making the approach as intuitive as possible for key stakeholders? As we think about monitoring risk, right, here we're thinking about the point I had made earlier about the issue of security controls decaying over time, threats evolving, thus underscoring the importance of organizations regularly testing their security capabilities and communicating changes in inherent risk factors. Now, if you were actually to submit your own Safety Act application, right, as DHS has its own way of thinking about effectiveness, and so the Science and Technology Directorate would look at factors such as operational testing and evidence around, probability of detection and false positives. It would look at suitable performance of, past deployments, the expertise of the personnel involved in the program, past audits, and customer feedback. As we think about effectiveness, and particularly in a risk monitoring context, we think about it in a couple of different elements. First of which is testing. We do see testing as critical for assessing control effectiveness. As I mentioned earlier, the findings aren't always intuitive, and so what we try to do is to kind of contextualize a pen test or an audit, both for operators and for senior leadership, into why was the test important, what did it find, and what did it actually mean in terms of security risk exposure. Exercises can offer a safe environment to sensitize participants to security threats, strengthen response functions, and validate the effectiveness of policies, procedures, and capabilities. And metrics can also be extremely important in terms of reporting. Now, I think that there's a key opportunity to make further progress on metrics. And the important thing here is to think about how metrics correlate to effectiveness. In many organizations, metrics are frankly in a rather poor state, focusing on raw numbers of vulnerabilities, firewall blocks, numbers of investigations, personnel credentialed, doesn't necessarily tell you anything about whether the program is effective or not. And so we need to think about metrics that are more closely aligned to, am I actually managing risk in an appropriate way? So as we think about what an effective program looks like, let's try to use another historical analogy, and I'll come back to World War II. After the subjugation of France, starting in the summer of 1940, the German Luftwaffe launched massive attacks, mostly at night, against major urban and industrial targets. Came to an end in 1941. And so how did Britain respond? Right? Well, the first piece was to kind of understand the threat. And the texts that I've read talk about how the Brits outclassed Germany in the ability to collect and analyze threat intelligence. Germans, for instance, never really understood Britain's core production and supply chain locations. The next element of a security program involves, as we talked about earlier, thinking about high-value assets. And so if you think about the beginning of World War II, and you think about in late 1930s, early 1940s Britain, think about what would have been a crown jewel, what would have been a high-value asset, what would have been basically core to the future of the nation. Well, if you'd been through World War I and you lost a generation, it's the children, right? I mean, the children were key to particularly having lost a generation in World War I, the future of that nation. And so in Britain, starting in September of 1939, more than 3.5 million people were relocated out of the cities into the countryside. For those of you that have read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you'll remember that the Pevensey children in Narnia were in the countryside because they'd been evacuated from London. So beyond understanding the threat and understanding what matters most, right, owning the risk becomes critical to maintaining an effective security capability. And so then we think about, well, what capabilities are we actually talking about? And coming back to the intelligence point, right, the ability to predict ends up being critical. And we think about the way that the UK was able to undertake cryptanalysis of the Enigma code machines in World War II to read substantial amounts of secret radio communications of Axis powers and gain operational advantage. From a protection point of view, right, we think about as those air raids started over the course of the year, the movement of kids out of London, but also for folks that stayed behind, how they might be protected. And in the height of the attacks in 1940 and leading into early 1941, you had as many as 150,000 people a night in London underground stations. As we think about detection, by the time of the Battle of Britain in mid-1940, the Royal Air Force had basically fully integrated radar as part of its core defensive capabilities, whereas the Luftwaffe relied on often out-of-date reconnaissance data, fighter sweeps. The RFA had with a high degree of accuracy, they knew the formation strengths and intended targets of German Air Force. You obviously, beyond detection, need to have an ability to identify and classify threat. And then when you think about response, right, I mean, you had, take for example, London, 9 million people, a third of the country's population at the beginning of World War II. In the first 22 days of the Blitz, you had 10,000 fires in that city. And so what you saw from a response perspective was the London Fire Brigade growing from 2,500 people to an auxiliary force of greater than 28,000 people. You had fireboats, and you had other efforts to, through the use of decoys, confuse and divert the attackers. But so beyond core capabilities around predict, protect, detect, identify, classify, and respond, then you have, from a risk monitoring perspective and from a kind of an action perspective, issues around evaluating performance, revising and updating the program, and building partnerships. And indeed, by 1941, the UK had liquidated so many assets that it was basically running out of cash. And so the United States, President Roosevelt eventually came up with the idea of Lend-Lease to get badly needed supplies to the UK and other allies. And in fact, as we think about other allies, it's by 1945, I think nearly a third of the truck strength of the Soviet Red Army was actually US built. And so what are the takeaways from this more broadly, right? Risk elimination is impossible. The threat will continue to adapt. And really the question is our ability as a society to adapt to change. Effectiveness is not about eliminating risk, right? It's also the case that overweighting on prevention can lead to a false sense of security. And really what we're trying to accomplish is to be able to maintain resiliency in the face of changing risks. So at the Chertoff Group, we believe we're, for a number of reasons, uniquely positioned to help clients manage security risk. We work across a number of sectors. We've anchored on the life cycle of assess, mitigate, and monitor. We feel like we're fairly unique in terms of the DHS approval we have. Because we also work with vendors and policymakers, we feel like we've got a fairly broad view on the way risk is changing. And we feel like we have a pretty unique team comprised of former security agency heads who know how to communicate risk, manage events, and challenge organizations. We've got a bench of certified security professionals. I have a CISSP. I've got colleagues with CPPs and other certifications. And we draw on a further network of global security advisors and technical partners.